May 10th, 1775. The Champlain Valley is a rugged scar in the earth that separates the green mountains of Vermont from the imposing peaks of New York. The world here is dominated by water and rock, a place of beauty. In the middle of this watery highway sits a fortress. The French call it Carillon, the place of chimes, named for the roaring sound of the nearby waterfall where Lake George empties into Lake Champlain. The British call it Fort Ticonderoga. To the military strategists of the 18th century, it's known simply as the Gibraltar of America. Whoever holds this stone star holds one of the key entry points to the colonies. And inside this fort, 48 British soldiers are asleep. They are the men of the 26th Regiment of Foot. They are far from home, garrisoned in a crumbling relic of a previous war, surrounded by a wilderness they barely understand. They sleep soundly, comforted by the thick limestone walls and the belief that the disturbances in Boston are hundreds of miles away. They believe they're at peace. They believe they're safe. They're wrong. Drifting out of the mist, rowing silently across the lake are two small stolen boats. They're crammed to capacity with 83 men. These are not professional soldiers. They're farmers, woodsmen, hunters, land speculators. They're fueled by rum and a burning hatred for authority. Leading them are two men who despise each other almost as much as they despise the British monarchy. One is a giant, a folk hero of the frontier, a brawler who loved drinking and fighting. His name was Ethan Allen. The other is a short, meticulously dressed merchant, burning with a feverish ambition to prove himself a gentleman and a warrior. His name was Benedict Arnold. These 83 men are racing the sun. If dawn breaks before they reach the western shore, the British sentries will spot them. The fortress cannons, over 200 of them, will turn their boats into splinters. They'll be slaughtered in the water. What happened next was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was more of a heist. It was a desperate gamble by a ragtag band of rebels playing out in the dead of night. It was also the first offensive colonial operation of the newly minted Revolutionary War. This is the story of the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. To understand that night in May of 1775, we must first understand the ground itself. Ticonderoga was not just a fort. It was a place of lore in North America. It sat on a high promontory at the confluence of Lake Champlain and Lake George. Why this was important is because in the 18th century, before highways and railroads, water was the best way to move armies through the wilderness. The Hudson River flowed north to Albany. The Richelieu River flowed south from Canada. Between them lay these two lakes. If a British army wanted to invade the colonies from Canada, they had to pass Ticonderoga. If the Americans wished to invade Canada, they had to hold Ticonderoga as a base of operations. It was the padlock on the door between these two countries. The fort itself was built by the French in 1755. At the time, it was a masterpiece of military engineering. It was a star-shaped fortification designed to deflect cannonballs and provide overlapping fields of fire. And in 1758, during the French and Indian War, a British army of 16,000 men attacked this fort. The French defenders, outnumbered 4-1, held their ground. The British commander, General Abercrombie, ordered a frontal assault against the French breastworks. It was a massacre. Over 2,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in a single afternoon, making it the bloodiest battle fought on North American soil until the American Civil War over a century later. Now, less than 20 years later, the Gibraltar of America was rotting. After the British finally captured it in 1759, the frontier moved west. Ticonderoga became just a backwater stop on the way west. The harsh winters of upstate New York clawed at the mortar. The walls were starting to crumble. On top of that, the garrison was reduced to a skeleton crew. It was more of a backwoods village than a fortress, a place for older soldiers to finish out their service. It was no longer a battle-ready stronghold. It was a nursing home for the British Army. But inside those crumbling walls, the British unknowingly guarded a dragon's hoard. To see why, we have to back up 1 month earlier to April of 1775. The American Revolution had just begun with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. As a result, militia from New England quickly converged on Boston, effectively besieging the trapped British army. Yes, it was technically a siege, but it was a relatively toothless siege. You see, the Americans They had muskets, they had fowling pieces, they had pitchforks, but they had no heavy artillery. They could shoot at the British sentries from behind trees, but they could not threaten the British fleet in the harbor. They could not knock down the British fortifications. General George Washington, the soon-to-be commander, faced a grim reality. Without heavy guns, the siege of Boston would likely fail. The British would eventually break out, and the rebellion would be crushed in its cradle. Desperate eyes turned north. Intelligence reports whispered of the riches at Ticonderoga. The fort held cannons, over 200 of them. Take Ticonderoga, get the guns. Get the guns, and you have a chance to keep the revolution alive. But the Americans weren't the only ones looking at the map. The British were beginning to wake up to the burgeoning threat of the colonies. If they were to reinforce Ticonderoga, then the corridor to the north would be sealed. They could then launch an offensive from Canada into the colonies. Time was ticking, and the government in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress, was still debating whether they were actually at war. The Congress was hesitant, cautious. They were still sending olive branches to the king. They were not ready to authorize an invasion of a royal fort. But in Connecticut, men of action were done waiting. By late April 1775, a secret meeting took place in Hartford. Silas Deane and Samuel Parsons, prominent members of the Connecticut Committee of Correspondence, realized the opportunity. And more importantly, they didn't wait for official permission. They dipped into the colonial treasury and withdrew 300 pounds to fund a private expedition. This was real Black Ops warfare, 18th century style. There were no official orders. If the mission failed, the organizers would be disavowed and forced to pay the money back. If it succeeded, they would be heroes. For this to work, the Committee of Correspondence needed men who knew the terrain, and they had one specific man in mind, a man who was already at war with New York authorities, one who commanded his own private army, a man named Ethan Allen. You see, Allen was a force of nature, standing over 6 feet tall in an era where the average man was 5'7". He was practically a giant. On top of that, he was loud, profane, charismatic. He was a theologian who wrote books on philosophy, as well as a brawler who could drink any man under the table. Most importantly, Allen was the leader of the Green Mountain Boys. The boys were a rough bunch, armed with tomahawks and hunting rifles. They didn't wear uniforms. They marched to their own drumbeat. They were essentially a vigilante group formed to defend the land titles of New Hampshire grant settlers against the tyranny of New York land barons. To the governor of New York, Ethan Allen was a terrorist with a price on his head. To the settlers of the grants, he was George Washington and Robin Hood rolled into one. And thus the Committee of Correspondence sent messengers riding hard to the north, into the wild territory known as the New Hampshire grants, a place we now call Vermont. When the messenger from Connecticut arrived with the 300 pounds and the plan, Allen didn't hesitate. He rallied his boys at the Catamount Tavern in Bennington. He told his men, "The gods of the valleys are not the gods of the hills." He promised them action. He promised them glory. And he promised them rum. And it was from Bennington they began to march north to Castleton. While Allen was gathering his woodsmen, another man was riding north from Massachusetts, burning with a very different kind of ambition. That man was Benedict Arnold. Arnold was a wealthy merchant from New Haven. He was a man of intense, prickly honor. He was short, athletic, and possessed a boundless energy that bordered on mania. And it was Arnold who approached the Massachusetts Committee of Safety with a plan to take Fort Ticonderoga. He told them that he knew the area around Ticonderoga. He told them he could take it. Impressed by his military bearing and his detailed knowledge of the area, they granted him a commission as a colonel. They gave him money, gunpowder, and the authority to raise 400 men. Arnold rode west like a demon. He had the paper authority, but he had no men. He planned on recruiting them in western Massachusetts. But when he reached the border, he learned that Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys were already on the move. And Arnold was horrified. He viewed Allen as a rabble-rouser, a brute with no military standing. Arnold believed he was the commander of this expedition, and he refused to let this opportunity for glory slip through his fingers. He immediately abandoned his recruiting efforts and rode ahead with only a servant, determined to take command of Allen's army by sheer force of will. and it was on May 9th that the two men finally collided in Castleton. The meeting was less a council of war and more like striking flint over an open powder horn. Arnold arrived at the rendezvous point, resplendent in his scarlet uniform, waving his commission from Massachusetts. He walked in and demanded that Ethan Allen step down. The Green Mountain Boys stared at him in disbelief. Who was this peacock? The reaction was both immediate and hostile. The soldier, Allen's neighbors and drinking buddies, threatened to shoulder their muskets and go home if old Ethan wasn't in command. They had signed up to follow Allen, not some stranger from Connecticut with fancy papers. A mutiny was brewing. The expedition was on the brink of collapse before it even began. Finally, a tense compromise was reached. Arnold would be allowed to march at Allen's side at the head of the column, but Allen would give the orders. It was a joint command in name only. In reality, it was two men driven by ego competing for the same prize. Now, before the main force arrived at Fort Ticonderoga, these conspirators needed to know if the British were on alert. They needed eyes inside the fort. They sent Noah Phelps, a captain from Connecticut, on a mission of espionage. Phelps arrived at Ticonderoga a few days before the attack. He dressed in the rough homespun clothes of a simple woodsman. He walked right up to the main gate. He told the sentries he was a local farmer who needed a shave. The British were not on high alert. They had not heard the news about Lexington and Concord. In fact, they were bored and unsuspecting, so they let him in. Phelps sat in the barber's chair inside the fort, pretending to be a simpleton. But he kept his eyes open. He watched the guard changes. He counted the men. He looked at the walls. He saw that the formidable fortress was falling apart. He saw that the sentries were lax. He saw that the commander, Captain William Delaplace, was running the place like a country estate, not a military outpost. Phelps left the fort with a fresh shave and a head full of secrets. He reported back to the men. The garrison is weak. They're sleeping. They're ripe for the picking. The army moved out immediately. They marched through the night to Hand's Cove in Shoreham, Vermont, arriving around midnight. Across the lake, about a mile and a half away, the silhouette of Fort Ticonderoga was barely visible against the night sky. But now they faced a catastrophic problem. They had no way across this deep, freezing lake. You see, Allen had sent a detachment south to Skenesboro to hijack a large loyalist schooner, the Catherine. The plan was simple: steal the ship, sail it to Hand's Cove, and ferry the army across. So the men waited. They peered into the darkness, desperate for the silhouette of the Catherine's sails. 1 a.m., nothing. 2 a.m., still nothing. At this point, it was obvious the Catherine was not coming. Panic began to ripple through the leadership. The eastern sky was already beginning to soften into gray. If the sun rose while they were stranded on the shore, the element of surprise, their only real weapon, would evaporate. The expedition was about to fail before a single shot was fired. Just as hope was fading, a few small boats materialized out of the gloom. These were not the warship they had hoped for. They were just a couple of scows scrounged up from the locals. One was a flat-bottomed cargo boat, the other a bateau. Allen and Arnold looked at the two boats. They looked at their army, over 200 men. The math was obvious. The boats could hold perhaps 80 men at a time. It would take hours to ferry the entire force across, and they didn't have hours. They had to make a choice. Should we call it off? Should we wait for the next night? Or should we just go with what we have? Well, they chose to go. They would take the vanguard, the first 83 men. The rest, under the command of Seth Warner, would have to wait on the Vermont shore. This small first group would have to storm a fortress designed to hold off thousands. Allen turned to his men and delivered a powerful speech. He reminded them of their reputation as the scourge and terror to arbitrary power. He told them effectively that the eyes of the continent were upon them, and he asked for volunteers. You that will undertake voluntarily, poise your firelocks. Every man raised their musket into the air. The first 83 men in line were piled into boats. It was a tight squeeze. The gunwales rode dangerously low in the water. They rowed in silence. Dip, pull, dip, pull. They were guided only by the loom of the fort on the bluff. It was roughly 3:30 a.m. when they landed at Willow Point, just south of the fort's walls near an old charcoal kiln. They scrambled up the bank and huddled at the base of the walls. Allen and Arnold stood at the front, shoulder to shoulder, neither willing to let the other enter first. They decided against attacking the main gate. The main gate was barred and too heavy to breach without a battering ram, and they didn't have a battering ram. Instead, they headed for the south wall. There was a small entrance with a wicket gate. A wicket gate is a door within a larger gate, which was used for daily traffic in and out of the fort. The intelligence from Noah Phelps had indicated this spot was vulnerable. They crept up the slope. The fort was silent. Then, out of the darkness, a shape emerged. A British sentry. He was posted near the gate. He must have been terrified at what he saw. One moment, he was staring into the empty mist. The next, a giant man with a drawn sword was charging at him out of the mist. The sentry panicked. He raised his fusee and leveled at Ethan Allen's chest. He pulled the trigger. Click. A flash in the pan. The gun had misfired. The sentry wasn't about to wait to reload. He turned and ran like a rabbit, fleeing through the open wicket gate and shouting for help. The boys, they didn't hesitate. Allen and Arnold rushed through the entry, the rest pouring in behind them like a flood of angry water. Allen, displaying a surprising amount of tactical discipline in the chaos, ordered his men to form a hollow square facing the barracks doors. He wanted to trap the garrison inside their own quarters. The Green Mountain Boys formed up, and then they unleashed a sound that terrified the British more than any cannon. An Indian war whoop. The primal screams echoed off the stone walls. Inside the barracks, the British soldiers woke up to a nightmare. They stumbled out of their bunks, half-dressed, groping for weapons. One sentry tried to make a stand. He charged at an American officer, Gideon Warren, with a bayonet. He grazed Warren's side. Ethan Allen, witnessing the attack, came to Warren's aid. He raised his heavy sword and brought it down on the sentry's head. Sentry dropped, concussed and bleeding, but alive. Allen spared him, ordering his men to disarm him rather than kill him. The British resistance broke in mere seconds. The Americans controlled the courtyard. Even so, Allen knew the battle wasn't over. He needed the fort's commander. He saw a staircase leading up to the officers' quarters on the second floor of the West Barracks. He thundered up the stairs, shouting for the damned old rat to come out. Benedict was right at his side, and at the top of the stairs, a door opened. Standing there was not Captain Delaplace, but his second in command, Lieutenant Jocelyn Feltham. The scene was almost comical. Feltham was holding his breeches in his hands, sleepy, confused, surrounded by armed men who looked like wild beasts. By what authority? Feltham stammered, trying to maintain British dignity while holding up his pants. By what authority do you enter His Majesty's fort? Ethan Allen loomed over him. He raised his sword above the lieutenant's head and roared, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress!" Drawn by the commotion, Captain Delaplace finally emerged from his bedroom. One look told him the situation was hopeless. His men were disarmed. The fort was swarming with rebels. Without a fight, he surrendered his sword. The entire raid took just 10 minutes. By 4 a.m, without a single life lost, the great Gibraltar of America had fallen. While history has immortalized Allen's words, the reality of the moment was probably quite different. Allen likely barked something much saltier, leaving the diplomatic talk of Congress to Arnold. Still, Allen's mythical version captured the spirit of the moment perfectly. Divine right meeting political revolution. As the sun rose over the fort, the discipline of the attackers began to evaporate like the morning dew. The Green Mountain Boys had won, and they felt entitled to the spoils. They broke into the fort's liquor stores. They found the captain's private stock of rum. They began to plunder the personal belongings of the British soldiers and their families. Benedict Arnold was apoplectic about their behavior. To his professional mind, this was a military operation, not some pirate raid. He tried to stop the looting. He ordered the men to return the stolen goods. They just laughed at him. Arnold later wrote in his diary that he was often insulted and even twice shot at by Allen's men during the chaotic days that followed. They effectively stripped him of any command authority, leaving him to sulk in the headquarters while Allen reigned as the commander of Ticonderoga. Even while the looting was happening, the raids continued. The rest of the American force, led by Seth Warner, sailed north to Crown Point, another British fort just a few miles away. The garrison there was even smaller, only 9 men, and that fort also surrendered without a fight. Meanwhile, the captured schooner from Skenesboro raid was armed and renamed Liberty. Benedict Arnold, finally finding a job Ethan Allen couldn't do, took command of the ship. He sailed north to St. John's, raiding the British shipyard there and capturing another British sloop. In just 1 week's time, the America had gone from having no navy to controlling Lake Champlain completely. They had slammed the door on any hopes of a British invasion from Canada. In fact, Ticonderoga wasn't just a gateway to the south, it was also a gateway to the north. Later in 75, Congress would use this exact route to authorize an invasion of Canada. But the most immediate legacy of the captured fort lay in the heavy iron guns sitting in the fort's courtyard. General Washington, currently besieging Boston, desperately needed them. But the autumn roads were muddy, an impassable nightmare. At this point, Henry Knox enters the story. Knox was a 25-year-old Boston bookseller. He was overweight, jovial, and had absolutely no military experience other than reading books in his own shop. But he had a genius for logistics. He told Washington he could get the guns and that the coming winter snow wasn't an obstacle, it was the solution. And in December of 75, Knox arrived at Ticonderoga. Of the 200 plus cannons at the fort, most were rusted and unusable. But Knox managed to salvage 59 pieces of artillery. The haul included massive 24-pounders, iron giants that could smash a ship's hull from a mile away. It included the Coehorn mortars, small stubby weapons with handles that acted as the tactical artillery of the day. And finally, the prize of the collection, the French brass. You see, iron guns could burst if they got too hot or rusty, but brass guns were not only lighter, they were more durable and incredibly rare. Finding these sitting unguarded was like finding a pile of gold bars in an abandoned shed. In total, these 59 cannons weighed 120,000 pounds, 60 tons of metal, and Knox needed to drag them 300 miles through the freezing wilderness to Boston. But that's a story for another day. I hope you enjoyed this look at the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. Before we go, a special thank you to the Patreon supporters on screen right now for backing the channel. If you want to join them and get access to the downloadable maps from today's videos or read the full script, you can find that link in the description. Let me know your thoughts on today's episode in the comments below. If you learned something new, please hit the like button. Consider subscribing. Again, thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day if you want to.